From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers, as well as our Arabic language program, Podcast Al-Awsat, hosted by MEI Senior Fellow Ibrahim Al-Asl. On today's program, we'll be talking about Lebanon. Over the past 2.5 years, the country has faced a daunting trifecta of economic, financial, and political crises. The consequences have been severe, including widespread impoverishment, large-scale immigration, and a growing humanitarian catastrophe, as well as the very real risk of state collapse. Elections are scheduled for mid-May that could provide an opportunity for change, but Lebanon will need substantial international support to put the country on a path to recovery. There's a lot to discuss, but we're lucky to have two excellent guests on the program today to help us make sense of things, Randa Slim and Gabriel. Randa is a senior fellow at MEI and the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Ed is a former U.S. ambassador to Morocco and the current president of the American Task Force on Lebanon. Randa, Ed, welcome to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Alistair, and with Ed.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with both of you.
Before we delve in, I also want to note for our listeners that ATFL and MEI recently published a policy brief laying out recommendations for U.S. policy on Lebanon. That's available on both of our websites, and I would encourage everyone to give it a read. Randa, Lebanon's economic, financial, and political crises have gone from bad to worse over the past 2.5 years. You were in Beirut just a few months ago. Can you give us a sense of what the mood was like there and where things stand more broadly?
The mood was very dark. People were depressed. I mean, you are talking about a country that is really traumatized, a people that is traumatized. They have been going through a lot for some time. They've had the port blast, which really many people on a personal level suffered from. But at the same time, it's a country of, mysteries. So there are two pictures that come to mind based on this trip. So one picture of going to this area where you have lots of restaurants, and they were full of people, right? Full. And the same night, I go just like few meters outside the restaurants, and I see kids who are digging, in dumpsters for food. So there has always been an economic divide between like a top maybe 5% and the rest of the country. I think this divide has deepened even more. And the desperation of the majority of the country, now more than 75% of the Lebanese are under poverty lines, has increased. And when you talk with young people, all they talk about is trying to find a way out, especially educated, trying to find jobs outside, try to go out for graduate school. So I'm very worried about this crisis marking another major brain drain for Lebanon.
And building on what Randa just said, Lebanon's facing a number of major challenges right now. What do you see as the most pressing ones in the near term?
That's a good analysis there, Randa. Thank you. This has been viewed by the World Bank as possibly one of the 3 worst disasters since the 1850s, if you can imagine that. The failure of Lebanon has happened so fast and is so deep and hurtful that it has caught the attention, in some ways, thank God, of the international community. I think the two biggest upcoming needs that we need to focus on is, number one, Lebanon has to come to an agreement with the IMF. I don't see it being able in the short term to pull itself out from complete failure without an IMF deal. And right now, that's questionable. The second thing is, and I think we'll address Randa's comment about how people feel, they're becoming hopeless, is really focusing on the elections, having free and fair elections and making sure they're on time and correctly funded so that they can happen without incident. In both cases, right now, much more work has to be done.
Randa, there's one other issue that I wanted to touch on as well, and that's food security. Lebanon is heavily reliant on wheat imports, the overwhelming majority of which comes from Ukraine. And given the Russian invasion and the conflict there are major question marks over the security of supply. What's being done to prepare for any potential disruptions?
Well, the Minister of Economy held a press conference not long time ago in which he discussed this issue. And he said 60% of Lebanon's grain imports come from the Ukraine. And he said that they have only 1 month of reserves for the country. Remember, the grain silos were destroyed in 2020 during the port blast, and they have not been repaired. And so that partly explains why they have not enough reserves of grain. So they have only 1 month. And he said the government of Lebanon has started talking with India and the United States to see if they can make up for the shortfall. So it's all part of, we are talking, but there is no really plan, to deal with this unfolding, in my opinion, emergency, which Lebanon will be facing in short time. But let me just quickly also talk about two other impacts of the Ukraine fight on Lebanon. And one has to do with the increase in energy prices, partly because of the Ukraine invasion by Russia. So this 10% increase in fuel prices will have larger impact on Lebanon's balance of payments than what wheat prices, and the increase in wheat prices are having at the moment. And the second point I want to make, in addition to the food security and the energy security, and by the way, there are no plans, to address the energy security issues. But the third point is having to do with funding for the Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Now, as the humanitarian crisis and tragedy unfolds in Ukraine, there will be competition in the international community for the humanitarian dollar, if we can put it this way. And I can see easily, a lot of the funding that used to go to the Syrian refugee being prioritized for the Ukrainian refugees. Remember, we are already at about 600,000 Ukrainian refugees. It took few years of the Syrian conflict to reach 500,000 refugees. So imagine the numbers we are going to see as Russia will increase its tempo of destruction and carpet bombing in Ukraine. And so that will, in my opinion, have impact on the international community's willingness to come up with funding for other refugee crises, Syria, but also Yemen. And the question is, will the region, will the countries of the Middle East, especially in the Gulf, will be able to step up? Will they be willing to step up to the plate and make up for the shortage that will ensue if more of the Western aid is going to go to the Ukrainian refugees in the future?
Just to really underscore what Randa just talked about, let me just give you some numbers from the United States as well. Randa, there's some good news in this. Right now, it looks like the funding for this past year for Lebanon is going to go through, and they'll get increases, and the Ukraine situation won't affect it. Also, by next week, we should have the 2022 budget approved, and right now it's baked in to give a massive increase to Lebanon. Where we're looking for extra money for Ukraine is above the current budget. So the Biden administration is asking for $6.4 billion, about half for military, half for humanitarian. That will be hopefully over and above the current budget allocation and the current agreement that's being debated right now. So we hope it's in addition to, and at least in the short term won't affect us. However, what Randa says is true. They can always reallocate their priorities, and at a minimum, the more we focus on Ukraine, the less we focus on refugees other places.
Unfortunately, there's no shortage of crises in the world today. Ed, you mentioned it earlier, but I wanted to delve into the issue of an IMF bailout in a little bit more details. That'll be absolutely essential to mapping out a road to recovery from Lebanon's current situation. Talks with the IMF are currently ongoing. Do you have a sense of where they stand and what the key sticking points are?
Where things stand, the IMF team is in Lebanon right now, and their purpose, as I understand it, is to see if enough progress is being made or can be made to have a next round. So they're not really going through the next round. They're seeing how far advanced the Lebanese government is in their thinking. And we'll know next week when they return how they feel about a next round, which I think will happen. But look, they've got to, one, pass a budget. The Council of Ministers sent a budget to the president. He signed off on it, and it now goes to the parliament. And we'll just see how that budget looks to the IMF and whether or not it even gets approved quickly. So that's just one little step. But then they have to really look at a plan that where small and medium depositors are protected in any IMF package moving forward. We're calling for a single exchange rate. Right now, it sounds like the current budget would have different exchange rates. That's not going to make it with the IMF, I don't think. They have not addressed the social safety net needs. We can talk more about that. Randa touched upon it. 70% poverty rate or higher right now. And what's sad is there are about $2 billion being offered either through the SDRs of the IMF fund, which I think it's over $1 billion for that allocation, and another $900 million sitting in World Bank coffers waiting for programs from Lebanon for them to approve them. Nearly $2 billion, and they can't even come to an agreement on how to spend the money. And that really affects the social safety net program. They have to also think about fair distribution of losses in this, a new procurement law that deals with corruption. And then how do they deal with the electricity sector? All of these things are yet to be addressed. They're on the first one, the budget, and they haven't approved that yet. So this government, Prime Minister Mikati's government, has a lot of work quickly to do. I know the IMF is predisposed to want to be helpful, and we'll know next week if, in fact, they got there.
Randa, Prime Minister Mikati's government has said they're aiming to reach a deal with the IMF before the upcoming elections in mid-May. Given everything that Ed just laid out there, that seems like a pretty tall order. And I also can't imagine there's going to be much appetite for those kind of unpopular reforms in the immediate run-up to an election.
Yeah, let me add to the list that Ed provided. There is a capital control law, which they have been draft law, which they have been debating for how long now? For like a couple of years, and nothing has been done about that. I agree with everything that Ed said. I agree with your question also, Alistair. I don't think there is appetite to pass these laws, make these difficult decisions to pass these laws before the elections, which are now scheduled for May 15. I'm still not sure they will happen on time. I think, there is an international push for them to happen on time. I was disheartened by a statement made by the Minister of Interior, which is usually in charge of holding the election and organizing them, when he said there will be elections. He did not say they will be held on time. And that for me is an indication that, they are trying to find if there is a wiggle room to maybe delay them by a bit or what. But hopefully they will be held on time, especially that there is this international push toward that. So I think, to be very honest, if all of these politicians engage in cost-benefits calculus, mostly to their own interest, respective interest, and they do not look at their decision via a national interest prism, more about what benefits them personally, what benefits their political boss if they are not the political boss. And right now, each of these people, each of these parliamentarians, cost-benefit calculus-wise, it definitely benefits them to delay these decisions, not to make the decision, which, as you said, are too costly politically.
Ed, there's no shortage of crises in the world right now, as we kind of touched on earlier, from the Middle East and around the world in places like Ukraine, Afghanistan, Yemen. Why is it so important for policymakers, especially those here in Washington, to keep Lebanon squarely on their radars?
Yeah, good question. Well, look, number one, Lebanon's in a very geostrategic location on the Eastern Mediterranean. Can you imagine if it fell into the hands of terrorist entities? And also, we share common values with the country of Lebanon. It's diverse religion, it's democratic efforts to remain democratic and move a democratic model forward. And quite frankly, they share in the same values with the Western countries. So there's a geostrategic reason as well, as I mentioned. Can you imagine if they fell into the wrong hands? And look, when we look at this situation, I don't think America will let that happen. You've got Israel to the south. You've got all kinds of problems on other borders. You've got the Gulf countries that are very worried. You've got the Lebanese constituency in America, and you've got the Israeli and Jewish American lobby in the United States all together worrying about Lebanon falling. So strange bedfellows in this case. but there is an effort to make sure it doesn't happen. And when you look at the LAF and the support the United States has given it and the ISF, the Internal Security Forces, and the Lebanese Armed Forces, the budgets are only going up, and they're starting to prove that they're capable of defending territorial integrity of the country. So in that sense, I think there's a strong willingness on the part of the United States military and the Biden administration, Congress, and some of our most important allies in the region to make sure this failure doesn't happen.
And following up on the issue of the Lebanese armed forces specifically, they've been pretty hard hit as dwindling salaries and resources affect troop morale, readiness, and capacity. The Biden administration has taken steps to provide some additional money for livelihood support for the LAF. How far will that go in addressing the issue, and what else do you think needs to be done on that front?
Well, I think that's a big success point for the ATFL, the MEI's work in this regard, and really pushing for a livelihood account to support the LAF and the ISF. This year alone, they took the original $125 million allocation for the LAF, increased it to $140 million. Then they came up with $59 million in deployment reimbursements, $59 million, which they weren't expected, which can be reprogrammed for livelihoods. They've also got another $67 million out for congressional notification now. That money will go to the UN, along with $16 million for the ISF. So it's reaching this important goal of $100 million with our allies to create a livelihood account through the UN to support the families of these security services. And of course, they are the ones that will protect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the country. So like I said before, the United States is firmly behind the LAF and the ISF, and it's really being shown with these efforts, that MEI, quite frankly, and ATFL and other friends of Lebanon have pulled together in order to create this idea of a livelihood account, which we think the funding of which should occur in the next few weeks.
Randa, you laid out some of the obstacles to reform earlier, but I wanted to kind of flip things around and look at the situation from the other side of the equation in terms of what the U.S. and other friends of Lebanon can do to help overcome those obstacles and encourage the government to pursue those really important reforms in areas like fighting corruption and ensuring the independence of the judiciary. What do you think the U.S. can do to help here?
There is now a lively debate in the Lebanese Twitter sphere about Ukraine versus Lebanon, especially when it comes to how fast the US, the European Union, other countries have come together to impose sanctions on the Russian oligarch, seizing their assets, as President Biden said, going after their yachts, going after their luxury apartments in Monaco, preventing their children from going to Western schools, versus, how long it's taking to go after the accounts of the Lebanese oligarch, many of whom are in parliaments, in governments, people whose decision-making was one of the main drivers behind the Ponzi scheme that has deprived millions of Lebanese of their life savings, including people, like my brother-in-law, a retiree from the LAF, who, served for years in the LAF with honor. And then he had his retirement to live off, and now he has denied this retirement at the age of 65 plus. So that's a question that's being asked. Why it was so quick to do it with the Russian oligarch, and the international community is dragging its feet on the Lebanese oligarch. And so every time from now on, we are going to talk about sanctions. People are going to, raise this Russian oligarch flag in our face, saying it is double standards here. Why are you letting these oligarchs go? Especially when it comes to the head of the Lebanese central bank. So one of the important, steps that needs to be made, I think, to restore more confidence in the United States, Europe being on the sides of the Lebanese, fighting against corruption, and fighting against institutionalized corruption, is to have a quick coordinated and synchronized steps, in partnership between the United States and EU and UK to impose sanctions on these oligarchs. As I said, many of whom are in the political establishment, but also in the banking sector. And what struck me today, a senior delegation from the Treasury Department has just concluded a visit to Beirut, and they issued a statement. I was looking at the statement earlier today, and here in that statement, they are calling for investigation of corruption in different banking entities and all of this by the Lebanese Central Bank and the Special Investigation Committee of the Central Bank. This is a central bank whose head, Riyad Salami, whose governor, Riyad Salami, is really the engineer of the Ponzi scheme, that has brought Lebanon to where it is today.
Putting the fox in charge of the chicken coop, as it were.
Exactly. And so this message, this statement now by the Treasury is really, people in Lebanon are going to look at it and say, okay, are you serious about this? I mean, you are putting him in charge of the investigation of corruption?
Ed, did you have something you wanted to add here?
Very briefly, boy, do I agree with Randa on this. And let me just add to the confusion. I think the United States has probably threatened a number of oligarchs that we don't know about. But they're holding back, thinking that these oligarchs somehow are the solution to answering some of the problems. So they don't want to pull the trigger on them. The question I have, and which I think plays right into Randa's point, is, how long do you wait? And I think this is confusing as well. At some point, you got to face the fact that these guys that say they can be helpful to you aren't going to be. And we need to pull the trigger on them as well.
I mean, let me build quickly on what Ed said. I think there is also this perspective, and I think of it, of course. I heard about it also, is that we are letting the Europeans who are investigating Riyad Salami and others, take the lead on this. And we are basically taking a step back. I agree with Ed. I think this has been going for too long. And what's happening with the Russian oligarch is really now shining the spotlight on our double standards. And we really need to step up to the plate here in pushing forward on sanctions targeting the whole political and banking establishment that is behind the Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, I think there's a little bit of this good cop, bad cop routine going on among the allies. And I think we've just got to face up to the fact that some of these characters are playing us, and we should pull the trigger on them as well.
Totally agree with you. Totally.
One other thing that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up is, of course, the May elections, the MidMay elections. That'll be the first opportunity for the Lebanese people to make their voices heard at the ballot box since the beginning of the crisis in 2019. Randa, what do you think needs to be done to ensure that they take place when they should and that they're free and fair?
So when I talk with my sister, I say, so what's going on? What are you hearing on TV? What are people talking about? And what she says, it's all about the elections, And she said all the talk shows are about inviting candidates. Everything on Twitter is about candidates putting up their platforms. Look, I mean, I'm not that hopeful about the elections leading to change, but if we can get maybe 10 new faces of the, let's say, opposition forward-looking groups elected this time, I think that's a major progress. After all, the last election, only one such figure was elected to the parliament. So if we can get 10 to 12, I don't think we're going to be able to get more, primarily because the different opposition groups and movements that were behind the protests in 2019 basically are not working in unison. They have not developed platforms, that address the real issue. I mean, none of the parties, the new political parties, has put forward an economic platform. How they are going to address the major economic issues facing the people of Lebanon. None of them. And so I think hopefully we can get 10 to 12 elected. But this work, this movement toward reforms needs to continue. And hopefully these 10 to 12 can provide a small critical mass, to advance the voices of the dispossessed, the voices of the people who are really suffering in the parliament.
Yeah, I just totally agree with Randa. I think she summarized it well. I'll give you one fact that plays right into Randa's numbers. If the opposition can take 10 seats away from the Hezbollah coalition, they'll be in the minority. So there's some hope here with 10 seats. And although majority doesn't rule on some of the most important issues, it does pick the president. And there are other reasons why it would send the right signal that they are not in the majority anymore. So I think we've got to explain to the voters that even if they get 10 seats, it's very important. It's a beginning. And so we have to really broadcast that widely and continually. Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask both of you about your outlook for Lebanon going forward, maybe starting with you, Ed.
Okay, well, that's why Randa and I are such a good team. I tend to be much more optimistic than I should be, and I think she's more realistic. Look, I think it all comes down to an IMF package in the short run. And so in that sense, I've got to hold out hope that somehow the international community can all pull together and focus on an IMF package as a number one step. Secondly, I believe that the coalition of partners that care so much about Lebanon and the influence the diaspora has around the world will give us enough leverage to move forward, to help Lebanon move forward. So I'm hopeful in that sense. And remember one last thing. It's amazing that Lebanon is being given the attention at the State Department and with the Biden administration and with Congress that it is right now when you consider all the events around the world. So in that sense, I'm also hopeful because they see the geostrategic importance of Lebanon and what it could do if it fell to the region and further complicate its ability to try to balance interests in the region with Iran and others. So I have to be hopeful on that score as well. Thank you.
Randa, how about you? Where do you see things going forward?
Look, I think in terms of the economic realities, economic daily life of people, I think it's going to be tough going forward and maybe even tougher than what they have experienced to date. However, there are signs of optimism. There is now this news about the launch of a Saudi-French humanitarian assistance mechanism for Lebanon. I don't know much about it and still preliminary news. So if that takes place and if this really takes hold, that means that, more and more regional, countries, especially big countries like Saudi Arabia, are paying more attention to Lebanon. I don't know. It's still early. It might not mean too much, but the announcement of the launch of such a mechanism gives me hope that, the region maybe is paying now more attention than they have been to the economic crisis in Lebanon. Two, my hope really rests in the Lebanese people. When I was in Beirut and I was looking at the opinion polls, a great majority of the Lebanese now are saying, we don't want the old system. They have really now realized that system has to go. But at the same time, when they are asked, for example, who we are going to vote for in the next election, they don't know who to vote for. Partly because I think the opposition, again, is divided. They are bombarded by too many new names, and there is not clear platforms, that each of these new political parties is offering, except basically putting forward new candidates, young candidates in the majority. So we might see more of an abstention vote, in my opinion, a higher abstention vote than usual. Usually participation rate in Lebanon is about between 50 to 54% usually. We might see more because people don't want to vote for the old, but at the same time, they don't know much about the young. But that realization that the old system has to go is hopeful, that means that more and more Lebanese are breaking with the way politics used to be run in their country and seeing that pattern as being harmful to their own interest. They are breaking with the old Zaim, with the old, leader, and they are trying to look differently. And then also when I talked with Lebanese, I think the level of maturity, political maturity that I sensed among old, middle-aged, young people is just amazing. They now can discuss details of the economics crisis. They can talk about the impact of energy prices on their balance of payments. A lot of it is because a lot of it has now become owned personally by them. It's not something out there that the central bank, needs to deal with. It's something they are dealing with every day on a personal basis. The increase, the jump in prices on a daily basis. So now they are talking to you about how the Ukraine crisis is going to affect us, food security, impact on wheat. So that level of political maturity over time is going to generate more, political participation, more demands for accountability from the leadership. That is a good sign going forward. So in the short term, I'm not very hopeful, but in the long term, I remain very optimistic.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Randa, Ed, thank you both for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was Randa Slim and Edward Gabriel. Again, for those of you that are interested in learning more, the ATFL MEI policy brief on Lebanon is available on both of our websites. You can also find all of our other coverage of Lebanon at www.mei.edu. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.